Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I want to talk a little bit about integral knives, and we're going to focus on the production side. I want to talk about what an integral is, why you might want one, what are its disadvantages, its advantages, and then talk about some of the options that are out there for integrals if you're looking to finally get a chance to try one of these little guys. So first off, what the heck's an integral knife? Well, it's best thought of as a contrast. This is a knife that is a conventional design. This is a Wilson Combat Eagle. It's just the first thing that I grabbed. And it is a sandwich kind of made knife in that you have a plate of titanium on this side, and then in the middle, you've got a set of standoffs and a blade. You have effectively made a blade sandwich. You take two pieces of material, and then you screw them together around the blade, and you end up with a folding knife. Hey, it works. And that is a very reasonable way to make a knife. It is a very robust way to make a knife. 99% of the knives in the world are made in such a way. But then there are people who do things a little bit different. An integral knife is where instead of taking two pieces of material and screwing them together to make a handle, you take one piece of material and then you remove the part where the blade goes. So this little guy here is a Reich 1508S. And you can see here that this is one continuous chunk of metal. They started off with a block of titanium, and then they removed the areas that they didn't need anymore, that they wanted to be clear. And so you have one continuous chunk between here and here. Just wraps around the backside. There is no gap in the back spacer because there is no back spacer. It's the same freaking chunk of metal. And every part of this knife basically needs to become a part of that titanium. So the stop pin in this case, they've actually milled right into this solid titanium handle. So it just lives right there and it's solid. It's just a part of that. In fact, the only things in this knife that are separate are the pivot area here. They've put in a lock bar insert, which sits on top of that integral frame. You can see there. And then the clip is a separate piece, but everything else is one continuous piece. This is another integral, the Spyderco Nirvana, although this guy has been reground, so the blade is not typical, but the rest of the knife is. And you can see again, it is one continuous piece of titanium. All these little lines are just for decoration and show. The only thing that's, attached to this guy is the clip, and that's just using those three little screws there. Neat little thing. This guy is the Benchmade Anthem. It's Benchmade's first integral, but it's an impressive little effort here. Because again, it is one continuous little chunk of metal here. You get screws for the clip here, you get the pivot screw, and then you get these two little guys, which help to support the axis lock. We'll talk about that in a minute here. Then finally, this is the CKF Tegral. I wonder what that's short for. But it is another integral. Hey, go figure, right? Solid chunk of titanium, and you can see they've milled out a place for the blade to live in here. Here, they've actually added these two little inserts here, but underneath those inserts, it's just one continuous chunk. We'll talk about those inserts in a second, but that's what an integral knife is. One thing I do want to clear up, though, you will sometimes hear a titanium frame lock called the Reeve Integral Lock, after Chris Reeve of Chris Reeve Knives, who was a very, very early implementer of this kind of idea. And the thing is, this just means that the lock bar is basically the same piece as one of the sides of the scale. You can have a knife that has a Reeve integral lock, but it is not an integral knife in the sense I'm discussing, and I'm talking about these guys here, the one solid chunk. So why would you do this, and what are the problems when you do it? So the good reasons to do an integral, at least from the user perspective, are simplicity and solidity. Simplicity, what I mean by that is that an integral knife can be very, very, very simple. On this knife, you have a pivot, you got a pair of bearings inside there, you've got a blade, and then you've got a clip that attaches. If you take this knife apart, all you literally need to do is unscrew this screw and pull the blade out after you push the pivot the rest of the way. That's really it. So you clean that one area, case freaking closed. There is really not that much going on inside this knife. A knife that is sandwich made, especially one that's relatively complex, where you've got like carbon fiber and liners underneath there and then lock bars and all sorts, there is a lot more complexity. There are a lot more things that can be out of adjustment. This screw could come loose, for instance, or if you tighten things, this is a good knife. Don't make me feel like I'm dissing on non-integrals, but there is a simplicity of an integral when it's done well that is really something to behold. The other thing is that feeling of solidity. This is really subjective. It's really odd to say it again. I'm not saying that a well-designed knife that's built like a sandwich is not solid, is not trustworthy. No, not at all. But there is this subjective feeling of I am holding one piece of metal that you just don't get very often outside of the integral world. There is this incredible feeling of just like this is one chunk. And that's really cool. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm making that up. Maybe it's entirely subjective, but it is something something I feel, and it is something I appreciate. There is just a sense of, wow, this is the next best thing behind a fixed blade that an integral can give you. And frankly, it's also a real challenge, which actually brings us nicely to the disadvantages of an integral. The problem with integral knives is that they are very, very hard to make. Instead of being able to start with flat chunks of material, you have to start with three-dimensional chunks. You have to start with blocks. And then you need to remove very, very carefully, maintaining the same kind of tolerances, this sort of material in the middle here. You need to go through, you need to remove all that. You need to cut out a lock bar when you can't get a bandsaw inside there. That is not a straightforward problem or issue. You need to be able to adjust the tension of this lock bar perfectly without being able to overextend it. So you need to use a bunch of heat to do that. You need to mount a detent ball inside the inside of an integral knife, which again, not straightforward challenges here. And then the weirdest challenge, but one of the biggest ones, is actually getting a stop pin in there. The stop pin is this piece here that the blade cracks against, well, shouldn't crack, but it hits against in order to stop the blade from keeping going in this direction. In some cases, some designs permit that to be a part of the frame, like on this little rike here, where you can see it just runs right up against there. But in other cases, that's not possible. So for instance, on the Spyderco Nirvana here, the stop pin, can see, hopefully, is right in there. But the thing is, that's not a piece of the titanium. In fact, what they did there is they drilled out a very, very small bore. Well, a bore exactly the size of that stop pin, that is. They drilled it out, and then they put that in there, and then they sanded very, very precisely, such that it kind of basically disappears. It's just very strongly pressure fit in there. It's a great design, and it works very nicely, but it is a significant manufacturing complication. Benchmade uses the frame again to do this, and because of the axis lock, it doesn't need to rely on that quite as much. But actually, Benchmade has their own issues in making an integral lock. For most Benchmade knives, the axis lock involves an omega spring. You can just see the edge of it right here, and that spring is shaped like, well, actually a little omega there, and that's that little, oh, come on there. It's that shaped like that, and that little thing grabs on one side, the axis lock, and it allows it to push, and it provides that spring tension that pushes the axis lock forward. Well, they can't do that here because usually it comes between the liner and the metal there. So instead, they've had to do something that they've never done before. They've got this rod-mounted axis lock thing, where there is a rod with a spring on it, and that rod actually, and that spring provides tension against the axis lock. It pushes it back in this direction. It's a cool little approach, and as a result, they've had to add a little complexity with two screws that allow that rod to, mount in there, but still, that's an added complexity. And with this little CKF guy, the reason for these little inlays, not just that they look cool, but it allows them to tap the stop pin in through a hole that's inside there. And so, again, there were a lot of complexities. Making an integral knife is not easy. If it was easy, everyone would freaking do it. So that's the disadvantages of an integral. Let's talk about some of the options and how I feel about them. Look, there are just not that many production knives out there that are made in this way because it is so hard and because it is so expensive. Maybe that's another thing to talk about disadvantage-wise. It is very unusual to find integral knives in titanium that are under $300 or $400. We're looking at $425, $425. I want to say about $425 here. I think this guy's a little bit more than that, but still, they are very, very expensive. I think the Wii is a little cheaper, this guy's a little more, and Lion Steel is making them out of aluminum, which reduces their costs a little bit, but still, integrals are very expensive, and there aren't really that many options for integrals. Like I said, I've got these four here, and then there were a couple of other companies that make them. Lion Steel makes them out of aluminum, like the SR1 and the SR2. The Wii 702 is another integral knife made by Wii Knives, that's a titanium lock, and then the Rayot Future is now discontinued. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of others out there, but still, there aren't that many of them out there, and this is a pretty good representative sample here. This guy, the Reich 1508, is actually very, very nice in a lot of ways. It has a lot of modern conveniences despite being an integral. It's got a lock bar insert, although it's an externally mounted one, which is kind of a neat little trick. You see none of the other knives here have a lock bar insert at all. Actually, it doesn't make sense for the Benchmade. Why do I flip this over? But anyways, that's kind of a neat little trick, and it's a difference with the rest of them. And so this is very nice, and it's got a very unique styling to it. You also get an over-travel stop right here, which I think is an important thing on an integral, because if you bend the lock bar too far that direction, you can't bend it way far back in this one, because of the nature of the beast. So there's a lot of good here. Unfortunately, it's very, very thick behind the edge is the biggest issue here. Reich is making a Thor series of integrals that are thinner behind the edge and actually are lighter weight still. They've done a lot more skeletonization in the back here. They're very, very neat knives, but they're also going to be very expensive. The Spyderco Nirvana I have a full review up of, and it is a great knife in a lot of ways. Well, specifically, the production Nirvana is a great knife in this way and not a great knife in this way. The blade on the production Nirvana is very, very heavy, very, very thick, and it's not really meant to cut. That's why this guy was reground by my buddy Jim, who loaned this knife along. And so, you know, if you want something that's a little more hard-usey, the original Nirvana is a great thing, and if you want something that isn't, this regrind is incredible, but it gets very, very expensive. But I do like very much this knife, and it is, for what it's worth, an authorized sort of production version of the Peter Rizzenti Nirvana. And Peter Rizzenti is known for making custom integral knives that are just incredible. I'm only talking production here. The Benchmade Anthem's got some serious advantages as well. The axis lock running on bearings with the integral handle is a really great system. This knife has a fidgetability factor that is just off the charts, and frankly, it also cuts things. It's got relatively thin blade stock here, and it's just, there are a lot of wonderful parts to this. Unfortunately, the clip just isn't so very good on this guy, being on hard texture and not having a whole lot of flex. But you know what, aside from that, watch my full review that'll no doubt come out one of these days, if it hasn't already by the time I hear this. But there is a lot of compellingness to this little guy here, back with a good warranty and whatnot, so that's something to consider. The CKF Tegrill is probably going to be discontinued by the time you watch this. That's just the nature of CKF's beast. It is in some ways the most artistic looking of any of these, especially when closed. This looks like a modern art sculpture, although the Rayot Future, a Barucha design, may beat that. But still, it's a beautiful, beautiful knife. It's not to everybody's taste, and it's got some issues with the sharpening choil lack down here, and it's very thick blade stock and whatnot. But it is also a really neat little knife, and it is something to consider. Lion Steel's integrals are great, but they're also problematic. The SR1 and SR2 are great knives, except when you have to disassemble them, because they're using Teflon washers, and unlike with these guys, with all of these, in order to disassemble it, you just pop out the pivot here and pull the blade out. And there's not any tension between the two leaves of the integral, if that makes sense. It's not like when you pull the blade out, the front of this guy claps down. Unfortunately, on the Lion Steels, they are built that way, and that means you kind of need specialized tools in order to pop them back open to get the blade back in. Disassembling a Lion Steel SR1 was, oh man, was that a circle of hell. The SR11, which is their new titanium flipper, well, it's in titanium or aluminum, flipper flipper flame lock knife, yeah, is a very, very, very nice little knife, and it's running on bearings now, so I think it gets rid of some of those issues. The WE 702 I've only handled briefly, but seems to deal nicely with sort of a mix of these approaches. It hides its stop pin under a little well, a little insert, a collar basically around the pin there, and so that's a very nice approach. And you know what? It's a relatively thin blade. There's a lot of compelling in that little wee guy. Unfortunately, it's using terrible wee screws, at least at the moment. So that is a major disadvantage for it. For me personally, actually, the Benchmade is the one that wins this round. I love the reground Nirvana. This is a spectacular knife, and if it came that way from the factory, it might win the round. But the thing is, just coming from the factory, this is a really nice knife, and it's really compelling. And the axis lock is very, very nice here, both in terms of promoting that feeling of, oh my God, is this solid? And in terms of just its usability. It is really, really nice and beautiful to take apart. But the thing is, this is a very, very non-exhaustive list. There are more of them out there in the world, and by the time you watch this, like I said, this is June 2017. Who knows when I'll get around to wearing this guy? There are probably going to be more great options out there for you to check out. So that's what an integral is. That's why you might want them. These are some of the joys and some of the pains that you have to deal with, and these are my recommendations. This guy, if they ever release one with a better grind to it, and this guy, if they don't. And hopefully, though, at the very least, you've had yourselves an entertaining time, maybe you learned something about integrals, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of the day, and check out the full reviews. All these guys should be live at some point here, one of these days. Bye now.